Good morning, gardeners, and welcome to Monday, May 15th. Don't worry, this show has nothing to do with actual gardening, so don't run away if you're like me and can't grow green things. I'm speaking of gardening metaphorically. We're planting the seeds for a better day. We're starting our day by getting in the right mindset to cultivate a better life for ourselves, better communities, and a better world. So this past Saturday was World Fair Trade Day. This international observance is organized by the World Fair Trade Organization, which aims to create a more equal and positive working situation for laborers around the world. Many laborers producing some of the world's most lucrative products, like coffee, clothing, and chocolate, are living in poverty and collecting painfully low wages. Fair trade aims to change this. So our show today is actually going to be a sort of fair trade themed episode. I'm going to rearrange our segments and start with the learning moment because when I looked up the International Day and saw fair trade, it reminded me of something interesting I read in Doing Good Better by William McCaskill. I mean, you could call it interesting. You could also call it highly controversial. When I first encountered it, I found it pretty disheartening, but I'm hoping to reframe it for you today in a way that is encouraging. So, Doing Good Better is all about how to make the world a better place by donating your time, money, and work to the areas that are effectively doing the most good. Doing good in this book is defined as saving lives, improving quality of life, and extending lives. The author, William McCaskill, provides a mathematical formula that may be used for calculating the effectiveness of an altruistic effort. He also delves into quite a few case studies, and the fair trade movement happens to be one of them. He says, "We should certainly feel outrage and horror at the conditions sweatshop laborers toil under. The correct response, however, is not to give up sweatshop-produced goods in favor of domestically produced goods. The correct response is to try to end the extreme poverty that makes sweatshops desirable places to work in the first place. What about buying products from companies that employ people in poor countries, but claim to have higher labor standards? By doing this, we could avoid the use of sweatshops, while at the same time providing even better job opportunities for the extreme poor. If we really could effectively pass on benefits to the very poor through consumer pressure, then I would be all in favor of it. In practice, however, I'm not so sure that ethical consumption works as intended. To see this, let's look at the most widespread attempt to give the very poor better working conditions: fair trade. Fair trade certification is an attempt to give higher pay to workers in poor countries. It's commonly used for consumables grown in developing countries, such as bananas, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and tea. The fair trade license is only given to producers who meet certain criteria, such as paying their workers a minimum wage and satisfying specified safety requirements. The fair trade license has two benefits. First, the producers are guaranteed a certain minimum price for the good. For example, coffee producers are guaranteed to receive $1.40 per pound of coffee, even if the market rate drops below that. Second, producers are paid a social premium on top of the market rate. For coffee, if the market rate is above $1.40, the producers are paid an additional 20 cents per pound. This social premium is used to pay for democratically chosen community programs. Demand for fair trade products has grown rapidly. The fair trade label was launched in 1988, and in 2014, $6.9 billion was spent on fair trade certified products worldwide. The fact that so many people are willing to pay more to ensure that farmers in other countries are paid a fair wage is heartening. But if we're thinking about buying fair trade ourselves, we need to ask how much we're actually benefiting people in poor countries by shelling out a few extra dollars for fair trade versus regular coffee. The evidence suggests that the answer is disappointingly little. This is for three reasons. First, when you buy fair trade, you usually aren't giving money to the poorest people in the world. Fair trade standards are difficult to meet, which means that those in the poorest countries typically can't afford to get fair trade certification. For example, the majority of fair trade coffee production comes from comparatively rich countries like Mexico and Costa Rica, which are 10 times richer than the very poorest countries like Ethiopia. In Chapter 1, we saw how fast money diminishes in value and how extreme global inequality is. That means that even if buying fair trade was a good way of paying farmers more, you might make a bigger difference by buying non-fair trade goods that are produced in the poorest countries rather than fair trade goods that are produced in richer countries. Because Costa Rica is 10 times richer than Ethiopia, $1 is worth more to the average Ethiopian than several dollars is to the average Costa Rican. Up in the hands of the farmers who earn that money. Middlemen take the rest. The Fair Trade Foundation does not provide figures on how much of the additional price reaches coffee producers, but independent researchers have provided some estimates. Dr. Peter Griffiths, an economic consultant for the World Bank, worked out that for one British cafe chain, less than 1% of the additional price of their fair trade coffee reached coffee exporters in poor countries. Finnish professors Joni Valkila, Pertti Haparanda, and Nina Niemi found out that of fair trade coffee sold in Finland, only 11% of the additional price reached the coffee-producing countries. Professor Bernard Killian and colleagues from INCAE Business School found that, in the United States, while fair trade coffee would sell for $5 per pound more than conventional coffee, coffee producers would receive only 40 cents per pound, or 8% of that increased price. In contrast, remember that if you donate $1 to Give Directly, a charity mentioned previously in the book, 90 cents ultimately reaches the poor. Finally, even the small fraction that ultimately reaches the producers does not necessarily translate into higher wages. It guarantees a higher price for goods from fair trade certified organizations, but that higher price doesn't guarantee a higher price for the farmers who work for those organizations. Professor Christopher Kramer at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies led a team of researchers who conducted a 4-year study on earnings of fair trade workers in Ethiopia and Uganda. They found that those fair trade workers had systematically lower wages and worse working conditions than comparable non-fair trade workers, and that the poorest often had no access to the community projects that fair trade touted as major successes. Professor Kramer commented that the British public has been led to believe that by paying extra for fair trade certified coffee, tea, and flowers, they will make a difference in the lives of poor Africans. Careful fieldwork and analysis in this 4-year project leads to the conclusion that in our research sites, fair trade has not been an effective mechanism for improving the lives of wage workers, the poorest rural people. Independent reviews of studies have found much of the same thing. Though the evidence is limited, which in itself is worrying, the consistent finding among the studies that have been performed is that fair trade certification does not improve the lives of agricultural workers. Even a review commissioned by the Fair Trade Foundation itself concluded that there is limited evidence of the impact on workers of participation in fair trade. Given this, there is little reason to buy fair trade products. In buying fair trade products, you're at best giving very small amounts of money to people in comparatively well-off countries. You do considerably more by buying cheaper goods and donating the money you save to one of those cost-effective charities mentioned in the previous chapter. So I know that was a longer section than I usually read from a book this morning, but I wanted to give you the whole context and everything that William McCaskill argues. And also, just for your own reference, this book was written in 2015, so it is 8 years old at this point, and the research might be different now. I am not 100% sure on that, but generally, my understanding is that things like this, like large organizations and studies on a global scale, tend to move pretty slowly. So if it has changed, I doubt it has changed radically. So if you have been a supporter of fair trade, or if you've at least seen it as a movement for good in the world for some time now, I'd imagine that was pretty disheartening to hear, because it was for me too. Personally, I get frustrated when anyone brings up an argument that a charity, ethical nonprofit, or any other effort to do good is actually counterproductive. I hate to think that such an impressive amount of human collaboration and innovation is going to waste. Now, even though McCaskill delivers a pretty damning argument, I personally believe that fair trade will end up making the world a better place in the long run by raising labor standards. Emphasis on in the long run. While McCaskill's points are well-reasoned, I think that they are ignoring the intangible human element of changing the marketplace culture. But whether I'm right and he's wrong, or he's wrong and I'm right, our feel-good moment for the day is that these are good arguments to have. The fact that so many people are willing to buy fair trade products, even though they may be more expensive, is, as William McCaskill says, it's heartening and it's encouraging, because that means that all these people are willing to make changes in order to improve the world, even if it costs them something. There are so many options and so many competing opinions out there, it can be hard just to keep up with the various arguments, let alone decide how to interpret and implement them in your life. I currently believe that the old adage, just do your best, really applies here. Because, as I've spoken about in a recent episode, immense progress is made through sustainable changes upheld over a very long period of time. If we, in large groups like societies, try to implement unsustainable practices, we will make less progress in the long run than we would have if we would have just taken it easy on ourselves. So if you felt stressed out by the argument and doing good better, you are not alone, because it stressed me out too. But after I sat with it a while, it occurred to me that all of this analysis of what works and what doesn't work is based on statistics. And if you've heard the phrase that there are 3 kinds of lies, one of them including statistics, that's because these numbers don't always present a true picture of reality in a way that's important to humans. So for our focus moment today, I want you to think about judgment. Now, when it comes to judgment, I think most people fall somewhere on a sliding scale between you should never judge anyone at all and judge as much as you like, because judgment performs a useful function in society. Personally, I used to be at the far end of this spectrum. We'll call it 100% towards approval of judgment. I even prided myself on being a judgmental person because I thought that meant that I had high standards for myself, which obviously meant that I was a good person. Of course, now I know that that's a deeply flawed mindset, but I am still not quite at 0% judgment. There's a part of me that does still believe that judgment performs a useful function in society. So you could place me around 10% judgment on this scale, almost all the way towards no judgment. I think it is at least okay, and maybe even helpful, to just go ahead and judge anyone who knowingly acts immorally, harms others, especially when it's for the purpose of their own selfish gain. I also think that where to draw the line on acceptable judgment is highly debatable and highly personalized as well. After all, if you are judging someone else, especially if it's a public figure you will never know, your judgment really affects you more than anything else. So for me, most of the time when I decide to go ahead and judge, it's mostly for that cathartic feeling I receive. I have no illusions that judging will do anything to influence the actions of someone else or produce any kind of helpful change. But I hope we can all agree that it is not okay to judge someone who is simply attempting to make the world a better place. Similarly, It's not okay to judge someone just because they are not choosing to participate in your preferred method of altruism. I think it's fairly safe to say that everyone participating in altruistic activities are all actually on the same team. And as I stated previously, if we are debating with each other within our team, that is actually good because it can help us move toward more effective methods and produce real change. But judging someone on your team is just counterproductive. Now, in case you haven't seen where this is going yet, we're bringing it down to the self, down to you. You are on your own team as well. So it's counterproductive for you to judge yourself. If you're anything like me, you're more quick to judge yourself than anyone else. I've even heard it said that it's impossible to judge anyone else without first judging yourself. I'm not sure whether that's true, but I do know that if you begin to judge yourself when you hear someone talk about donating to charities or purchasing fair trade, it's probably time for you to work on letting that go. I don't think it's possible to participate in the conversation or the movement about how to make the world a better place if you are emotionally tied up in judging yourself or others for not employing what you or someone else currently perceives to be the most effective means of doing good. So what does all this mean for you today? Well, if you've been in the habit of purchasing fair trade and it's become a strain on your budget, I think it's definitely okay for you to let that go for now. However, if you have been purchasing fair trade and it's not a problem for your budget and you appreciate the mission and vision of the organization and you don't feel called toward examining a more statistically effective charity, I would say keep it up and more power to you. Now, if you've never even thought about fair trade and never even looked for these products when you shop, that's okay. And this focus moment applies to you too, because you can copy and paste the perspective I've offered today to any altruistic or world-improving activity. As long as you're honestly doing your best, implementing sustainable habits, you're doing great. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I will speak with you again tomorrow.